outside India, it cannot be taxed in India. They said we will not look at that approach of the Supreme Court because we have a recent ruling of the Supreme Court in the case of Vodafone, which says that don't look at the transaction, look at the transaction, don't look through the transaction. In other words, look at the substance of the transaction and don't look at the form of the transaction. And therefore, they said we will look at the form of the transaction and not look at the substance of the transaction. And therefore, they said that this entire substance is that this is only one contract and the sale of goods gets completed outside, completed in India. This created some difficulties. As I said, luckily the Delhi High Court in the latest ruling, because the citation I want to give you is called Linde AG. The Delhi High Court decision of Linde AG 365 ITR page 1, which is the latest ruling on the subject, which says that this theory which has been propounded by the AAR is actually, they didn't say it is all humbug. They said that doesn't make sense because there is a decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Ishika Wajima, which dealt with the matter, and you can't import the principles of Vodafone in the matter. And therefore they said that if the sale of goods is completed outside India, the offshore supply component will really not be taxable per se. On the AOP and the PE, of course, they remitted it back to the officer to look at the substance of the transaction. And in other words, they have undone all the ripples which were created by the various AAR rulings. The only other point I think which has been looked at in terms of structuring, I think because that is the second question, whether transactions could be restructured. Yes, transactions can be restructured as these various agreements have been correctly restructured. And I will request Vishal to maybe highlight some of the points because he had in a very beautiful article which was published in the CIT some years ago, highlighted some of the aspects which need to be kept in mind while doing EPC contracts and what really one needs to focus on while doing this restructuring. I would only act as a devil's advocate and again give you reference of one ruling because that shows how not to enter into contracts, and that is the decision of the Madras High Court in case of Ansaldo, where there was an unfortunate result because the onshore subsidiary which was executing the work and the services really did not have too much of competence, and probably the Delhi High Court felt that in the overall consideration that was split, a very large amount was actually attributed to the offshore supply of goods, and that seemed to be a kind of a tax avoidance of sorts. So the Delhi High Court decision, the Madras High Court decision in 310 ITR 237 and Ansaldo, and that is something that you need to keep in mind that one should not do in order to be liable to tax on the supply of goods. Finally, the umbrella agreement, I did make a passing reference when I gave my initial views, that the Supreme Court in case of Ishika Wajima and the other rulings have said that just because there is an overall umbrella agreement doesn't mean that there is a liability in relation to the offshore supply. Thank you.
I tried a lot to search for that article, I could not.
I had a copy.
Maybe what I'll do is, Mr. Agri, I'll touch upon some other points.
Sure.
Already the basic conceptual framework has been explained. See, it's very interesting when an EPC contract is being negotiated. There is only one company which negotiates a contract, which is the foreign company. So when you look at the real correspondence, when you look at the real world, there are no four companies really speaking with the Indian customer. There is only one company, the people traveling, negotiating this, that, and after the MOU, etc. has been signed, then the companies are incorporated, and then there are four separate contracts which are structured. And maybe therefore the first point is that how would this impact under a post-GAR scenario? Is it really that you actually intended that okay, only one company would really get the contract and then you have structured it? So I have no answer, but I'll just put this for
if I can only supplement is that this was posed to the Shom committee in the context of GAR, and I think the Shom committee said that as long as you are the offshore onshore, they were happy with, but they said that if the consideration is actually attributed to the offshore supply, then it would be clearly a case of tax avoidance, and GAR would be invoked. So that's my bit on the.
Yes, absolutely. So which actually means that the planning cannot start post, getting the contract. It has to start pre, bidding for the contract. The second point, interestingly, is the bifurcation of the revenues, and we know the whole game also is played on that. You know, offshore supplies suddenly get a bigger chunk of the revenues, and the onshore piece, would get an abysmal amount. And I think, I believe, even in the pre-GAR scenario, looking at the principles of McDowell and a couple of other decisions, this is something which the tax office can absolutely challenge, assuming they have the bandwidth to look into the factual aspect. The great thing is they do not understand the business. The surprising thing is we also do not understand the business. So we really go about and just look on the concept. But when you go into the detailed facts, these are few of the, I would say, open issues which anybody can come and create trouble for the client. A lot has been talked about the territorial nexus principle enunciated by the Supreme Court in the case of Ishikawa-Jima. To obviate and defeat that law, there was an explanation inserted in 2007. The explanation was very funnily worded to say that if the income accrues, then irrespective of that, the fact that no services have been rendered, it will still be deemed to accrue, etc. And it was not making sense per se. And there was always a doubt whether the territorial nexus principle vis-a-vis the rendering of services between a non-resident and an Indian customer still exists. I would believe that after the amendment of that explanation in 2009, now hopefully that issue has been put to rest, and you therefore need not look at the territorial nexus vis-a-vis services, and as Mr. Hegde said, really the source rule would apply per se. And you therefore just look at whether it falls under the characterization definition of services, and if yes, you will actually apply a withholding tax. The next question is about the AOP. Really, whether this whole arrangement is constituting an AOP, I would not dwell more into it. But maybe one question which probably Hitesh and Parin can look into it, that assuming it is an AOP, what is the impact under service tax? Because I do believe there are certain circulars which says that if it's an AOP, there cannot be a service within entities, and can we therefore stake a claim for a service tax refund in that sense per se. The next interesting impact happens under section 92B, subsection 2. So what happens is, let's say there is an umbrella agreement entered into between the non-resident parent company and the Indian customer. That umbrella agreement, that MOU, whatever you want to call it, details down the complete arrangement, the complete bifurcation of the activities to be done by the parent company or its subsidiaries in India or outside India, also highlights some of the major terms. But however, when the actual agreement is executed for the onshore work, the Indian subsidiaries execute the contract with the Indian customer. I would believe, assuming these key terms are mentioned in the umbrella agreement in some form or shape, then even the agreement between the Indian subsidiary and the Indian customer, which are absolutely unrelated parties, that would be regarded as a deemed international transaction, and actually they will need to comply with the transfer pricing regulations. That is a fact which I have seen many Indian companies miss out, and there will be some automatic penalties for non-documentation, non-filing.
I think we now have the amendment also.
Yes.
92B2.
Yes, amendment absolutely takes away the argument that this contract is between two domestic companies. So in spite of that, now it will be regarded as an international transfer pricing transaction per se. One more developing aspect is more on the subsidiary PE, subsidiary permanent establishment. Actually, when you look at the Article 5 of any treaty, be it US, be it Singapore, etc., the last limb of that article talks of a fact that merely because somebody is a subsidiary, that would not be deemed to be a permanent establishment. And I would believe the test would be whether a subsidiary is acting in its independent capacity or whether the parent company is directing almost each and every affairs of the subsidiary. If it is the latter, then clearly there is a higher risk that the subsidiary is acting on behalf of the parent company, and there could be a permanent establishment exposure per se. So even the subsidiary P angle might need to be taken into consideration. What happens if the offshore contract, which we will be strongly contending is not taxable in the absence of a permanent establishment? If there is a US president coming and there is a signing of that contract in front of the US and Mr. Modi in India. So does signing of a contract in India leads to any kind of a profit attribution? Of course, you will still like to argue that under the treaty there is no permanent establishment and hence there cannot be any profit attribution. But forgetting the treaty principle for a moment, if we have to look purely under section 9, there is a business connection and hence the only question which would remain is whether explanation 1A gets triggered, which would mean is there a small business activity happening, and if yes, a value proportionate to that business activity would be attributed. There are decisions to the extent that 5 to 10% of the contract value should be attributed merely because of the fact that the contract is signed in India. Of course, there the only defense would then be going under treaty first. Yes.
If I can only add, sorry,
yes.
disturb your flow of
Sure,
thought,
sure.
that in the attribution, Vishal, I came across this interesting instruction they issued way back in 87 in context of oil and gas installations, and where they said that 10% of 10% means 1% can be attributed for the supply of the goods in India. So maybe relying on the instruction, we can try and whittle down that. So even if there's a signing, whatever, if they said the goods are maybe supplied in India, and still you have to only limit it to 1%. So maybe that could be like a benchmark of sorts, relying on the instruction of the CBI.
Was the 10% because they were under the deeming fiction?
Yeah, they were under the.
So assuming they are not under the deeming fiction, would they allow
then
10
you
of
look
that?
at the instruction in relation to the power contracts which
Right.
were there,
Right.
the
Right.
89 circular, which
184,
also
right.
seem, which
Yeah,
also seem.
unfortunately that has been withdrawn. so
Withdrawn.
of course one might-
But if you see even in India and many other cases,
Right.
they still continue to believe that the principles laid down in the circular, even though it's withdrawn, will still continue to apply. So maybe for attribution, there can be an argument which can be made. When you spoke of 5%,
Yes.
I thought let me start with 1% so that we can at least then.
Then I think an interesting issue which arises in the context of EPC is what if really, the difference between goods shipped on the basis of FOB versus CIF. So if it's FOB versus CIF, and where say technically the ownership happens on the shores of India, again, is there any implications maybe under the indirect taxes? That's something if you can highlight, and more from a direct tax perspective also, can somebody say that the sale has happened in India, and because the sale has happened in India, there is a normal accrual under section 5. That is I would say a huge challenge. Fortunately, nobody really takes it up. There is a funny decision of Supreme Court in the case of Performing Rights Society. We'll actually discuss that in a bit more detail in the context of case study 2. But that is one more angle, which one might need to take care in an EPC. Now, very quickly, coming on to the planning aspect. An alternate planning which could be possible, and of course, it comes with its own shades of litigation. Suppose if the US company had entered into a single contract with the Indian customer. After entering into a single contract with the Indian customer, the US company would then subcontract the onshore piece to the two subsidiaries. The two subsidiaries would then carry out the erection, construction, onshore supply activity, etc. etc. The question which arises is that in a scenario where there is a subcontractor in India of a main contractor, does the subcontractor create a permanent establishment? Effectively, in simple words, if the construction P clause of a treaty talks about a threshold period of 6 months, can the number of days of construction spent by the subcontractor be regarded as the number of days spent by the main contractor? And if yes, then clearly there is a construction permanent establishment, and clearly this planning does not work. Very interestingly, I found at least one decision in the case of PIMS Bamag 318 ITR 190, where the view taken by the tribunal was that where you have completely subcontracted the work to a subcontractor, in that case, the number of days of construction carried out by the subcontractor cannot be added for the purpose of determining whether the main contractor has a permanent establishment or not. Of course, it can have its own share of controversies. When you look at the OECD commentary, the OECD commentary actually comments that for the purpose of counting the number of days of contractor, you have to include the number of days of the subcontractor. So in a way, there is a dichotomy between what the commentary states and what the judicial precedent in India states. Interestingly, there is a strong argument, and it is supported by several Supreme Court decisions of many European countries, that where the wording of a treaty is clear, OECD commentary has no bearing. There is one more way to read the OECD commentary, to say that Article 5, Sub-Article 2, under which the construction P clause is enshrined, you have to read it along with Sub-Article 1. Sub-Article 1 talks about the test of a fixed business and activity being carried out. There are enough and more decisions which says that if the place of the subcontractor is not at the disposal of the main contractor, it cannot be treated as a fixed business of the main contractor, and therefore a conjoint reading of Article 5.1 and 5.2 hopefully could lead to a proposition that I would not count the number of days of a subcontractor for the purpose of counting my construction fee threshold. As I mentioned, you do not have enough precedent. Merely on the basis of one tribunal decision, you cannot do enough planning, but this is something which you can think. Because if you are able to construct the whole arrangement in a main contract and a subcontract manner, it actually means that you would be remunerating the subcontractor only on a cost plus basis, and hence a very, very small margin of profits would be kept in India. The bigger piece you would be taking out of India and then maybe planning at your home country level. The second piece of planning which might be considered is on the supply of designs part. Typically, most of these designs are customized designs. These are like, I am not purchasing a ready-made shirt, but I am going to a tailor telling him, please, sew a shirt which matches my body size. Hence, that has an element of a service. Hence, you would typically test that payment under a fees for technical services rather than testing it under the royalty article. If that be the case, and assuming Singapore had a Mauritius company and India-Mauritius tax treaty does not have an FTS article, then a technically correct view would be that such income are now tested under Article 7, and in the absence of a permanent establishment, even the payment made for such designs, etc., should not be taxable in India under the treaty. Of course, we do have one negative decision in the case of TVS Electronics by the Chennai Tribunal, which has taken a very funny and, in my view, with due respect, an incorrect view, which says that, okay, if there is no FTS article, you come back under the Act and you tax it under Section 9. However, the characterization is clearly that of a business profit, and I would like to believe Article 7 will be applicable. You need to create substance, and which is the bigger challenge. It's very easy to really on paper tell that, okay, let the Mauritius company subcontract. And if you have gone to a Mauritius country, you will realize it's not so easy to really showcase technically skilled people there. So that's the difficult part. Advising is easy. So these were a few thoughts on the case study.
Just one last one. Yeah. On the point that he made also of the supply of design, so Vishal spoke about the fact of characterizing it more as technical services. There have been some case law developments which say that if the designs and drawings, as he said, are sued for the purpose of a shirt, it was a special made-to-order shirt, and if they take the character of being a part of the plant and machinery itself, or needed for the purposes of running the plant and machinery, then they can be considered as part of the sale of the plant and machinery itself. Is a decision of the Madras High Court in case of Navily Lignite, and then it will not be construed as royalty under 916, and that has been accepted by a couple of courts. So sometimes you may have probably an opportunity to even plan that portion as being part of plant and supply of plant machinery rather than being a supplier of a design as such.
Thanks, Vishal. Just to summarize, a substantial part of the audience is from the indirect tax stream. Perhaps, if I may say so, the international, in fact, just to tell you about Albert Einstein's income tax. Well, I also felt income tax the most toughest when I was practicing income tax. So now I practice service tax, now I am finding service tax the most toughest. And I am still not able to graduate to excise and customs. When I come to that, I will know that. So I think it's just, two sides of the same coin. You try to learn more of it, then you find how less of it you know and how difficult it is. The more you know that you know less. That's what it is. Just to some, so it's quite a while since I have been looking at international tax when I have been attending BCA, and I do agree with my friend Ramesh. The first time I heard Vishal, where he was a child prodigy, he certainly doesn't look like a child, but certainly the prodigy part is certainly there. Yeah. Now coming just to summarize, what you gentlemen want to say is, on the first 800 crores, whatever, 800 million, you want to say the entire thing is offshore supply. It will not be liable unless somebody can advance the proposition that there is some attrition towards India, where that part of the profit substantially is over invoiced, and that is part of this Indian part 400, 100. Correct? Otherwise it will not be taxable.
Or
Or
there is an
that is-
allegation that it is completed in India. The sale is completed to India.
But that part in Ishikawa, even if sales complete in India, I think you will be able to advance. Even if it's complete in India, the entire attrition, I think that will be able to advance. But small signature, I feel, with limited knowledge, should not, though it will be better. I agree with you.
Not to try and contradict you, but as Vishal said, that it is important that the sale FOB, sometimes sale CIF,
I agree.
in terms of commercial,
All that,
that
but
is a
when
very
we-
important aspect.
But if you look at the Ishikawa Supreme Court, the philosophy of the judgment is not to tax. Don't look at small things. Okay? You yourself said substance.
Right.
Now the question is, you are only saying that if the attrition is some part of it, which is where in this 400, 100, which the Indian subsidy complies. If that has been really speaking under invoice, okay, and some of it is attributed to that, then only there is an issue on 800. Otherwise, there is no 800. And with the transfer pricing guidelines for all of this being also being there, you are reasonably insulated on the 800. On the 200, you want to say as fees for technical service or royalty, whatever it is, it will be liable depending on the DTA. I think Singapore, you said that there is no article for FTS.
Mauritius.
The Mauritius. So if we route it through Mauritius, there is no FTS, and based on that, since there is no article for FTS, it will not be liable at all. Or the other view would be, since there is no article, the section 917 would be applicable. It will be taxed. This is the sum and substance of this part, correct? Am I right? Just want to summarize for everybody's benefit. The second part of it, you said on the restructuring, the entire thing can be directly with the US entity. Since there is no PE in India, the entire profits accrues abroad, not liable. Subject to, however, some part of the attrition due to the subcontracted companies, which they will be paying tax in India as a domestic one. Unless those two are treated as construction PEs, in that case, some attrition of that profit also will be considered. This is the second part of it. The third part, FTS, is a restructuring through Mauritius. Have I summarized correct? Fine. Now coming to the quick rejoinders, I think considering the first case study, I think the panelists will agree. Out of the 3 case studies in terms of time, we should give a weight of 60%. Am I right? Yeah. So we can maybe take another 15 minutes, 10:45, but we'll take another quick 15 minutes. In that, we'll finish the 4 rejoinders as well as any questions. You first wanted to remind me on the point that in case it is treated, and now that he is saying, I would like to have treat this as one single contract. And then would you change your thing? And before you come into that, the idea of an umbrella contract, I do agree that the entire negotiations takes place in a single point. But once it's put into the entire system, the idea is more in the form of performance. That ultimately you are liable. Now whether that itself is enough to say as a single individual contract, or there are other parameters. In the light of that, you can take this. And if you consider single contract, which he would like to in his restructuring, one other thing, so your views may change. And that's what Fred also pointed out. Quick reactions, if I can, 3-4 minutes from each of you.
Right.
Thank you.
So the point is whether this is considered as an indivisible contract or a divisible contract, again is a matter of facts. As far as all the indirect taxes are concerned, whether it is an indivisible or a divisible contract, all these taxes will continue to be applicable. That's the first point which we must remember. What it changes is that are you able to do some structuring, are you able to reduce certain amount of taxes or not, is what is important from an indirect tax perspective. So it is not that just because it becomes indivisible contract, so customs duty will not be applicable or excise duty will not be applicable. Maybe there are some more implications that on that entire contract, like 194C under Income Tax Act, WCT VAT will get deducted on the entire value of the contract and not only on the local part of the contract or commissioning erection part of the contract. So indivisible versus divisible, it has got its own advantages versus disadvantages. You need to evaluate that, number one. Number two, generally from my 25 years of experience, single contract with clearly defined divisible scopes of work, treating this as a divisible contract is the most optimized way of, I would not say minimized, but I would say most optimized way of doing the contract structuring and generally acceptable. Of course, subject to various clauses and all that, but this is so far generally being accepted. The third point you said about the umbrella contract. Now in this umbrella contract, and I agree, there are two types or three types of umbrella contracts. One is that you have the entire contract under the umbrella contract and then you have different contracts which are flowing. I have also seen that there are some umbrella contracts which are like a one-liner contract that, hey, I am the parent, so I take the responsibility. And Vishal, just to deviate that from that, a combination of two people have tried. What it says that umbrella contract is also a service contract. By way of an umbrella contract, I am saying that I will supervise all these 5 people and I will make sure that your erection, commission, installation and commissioning up to generating the power in our example will be complete. And if it doesn't happen, then I should be penalized. And for which I will charge you a separate consideration. Now that consideration may be a part of this whole contract. So 100 gets divided into 95 for doing the work and 5 for doing this entire activity of supervision, etc. So as a parent, it remains an umbrella contract because I am taking over the responsibility. I am getting my fees and therefore even if that contract is tested before the tax authorities, it still continues to remain a service supervision contract. And at the same time, project owner knows that he is able to penalize the parent if any one of these people are not performing well. Now whether this is a right contract, whether somebody can say that because the umbrella contract is worded in a particular manner and therefore all these other contracts are divisible contracts and therefore they should not have any indivisible contract implications or your PE implications is yet to be tested. But net, umbrella contracts are generally never disclosed to the tax authorities. They are generally commercial contracts which are entered between project owner and an EPC contractor to make sure that the contract executed properly. They go to the courts for commercial reasons, they go to the arbitrator for commercial reasons, but generally people don't disclose these contracts. Now if by virtue of a provision, if it is required to be disclosed, possibly the impact of this will have on the indirect taxes also, because if you are disclosing something to one statutory authority in India, by obligation you may have to disclose this to the other authorities, and therefore whether the tax authorities will treat this as a composite contract, etc., needs to be evaluated separately. And another one small point which I would like to add is that it is very easy to conceptualize these things at a policy level, but it is extremely important for us as an advisor to communicate to our clients that the entire documentation has to be laid down in the beginning and has to be followed very, very strictly. Because if you fail on the documentation, then you fail before the tax authorities on facts itself, forget about law. So it is very important to understand and make sure that at the time of framing the contracts itself, you have a set documentation and that documentation is followed by the clients. So I think there are two and one. So I'll just give you an example. Sorry sir, I'll just give an example, very simple example, a practical experience which I have seen. I said for a service on offshore service contract, you need to make sure that they are isolated contracts, a service contract and goods contract, so that the customs authorities do not try to levy service portion onto the goods portion for the purpose of valuation. services otherwise are normally not liable to customs duties. But generally, I mean, what comes as a service is designs, drawings, technical write-up, etc., etc., etc. It is very important to understand that when these services are coming into India,